Greetings, students. Getting ready for another video lecture, so bear with me here as I change screens and get us set up to get into today's topic. All right, we're going to be spending quite a bit of time here looking at chapter 14, which was your chapter reading assignment for this week. We're going to be looking at those three different systems that we talked about, or we're going to be talking about switching to the macro system. So to date, the coursework that you have done has really been geared towards micro practice, which is that direct practice with individuals and families or small groups. And so now we're going to talk about what it means to move to a macro practice piece and some of the different strategies and interventions that we utilize when we're doing that work. So let's get busy. So again, our objectives today are to really look at, define, and understanding the scope of macro practice, and understand the link between macro practice and micro practice, as well as looking at these other activities that are listed here as well too, and how we're going to do the evaluation of macro practice as well too. All right, so when we think about macro practice, this is this overarching term that characterizes practice that focuses on organizations, communities, groups, and policymaking levels. So when I think about macro practice, what we're thinking about is social work practice that is really designed to look at how decisions are made regarding policies, regarding various laws that happen in community settings, how taxpayer dollars are redistributed, and how they're actually funded. And that's all the way from the national level all the way down to the state level. So when we think about macro practice, and we think about how the legislative process works out, we have to understand that social workers play a very important role in working with those larger policymaking bodies to make sure that they understand the implications of the things that they're deciding to spend their money on, or our money on, rather, at the neighborhood and community levels. So when we think about macro practice, think about the laws that guide what social workers do and why they do. It's community centered practice. And so basically, the community is your client instead of having an individual or a family. And it's about really empowering the community or empowering individuals in that particular community to advocate for change on a socioeconomic and political level. So, again, we see it all the time with various organizations that from time to time protest when there is a need to do those kind of things to bring attention, bigger, large amounts of attention to various social issues that might be happening. I can think of a couple recently that I may have been involved in. Black Lives Matters movement, looking at instances of police brutality towards brown and marginalized people, as well as the women's rights movement a couple of years ago that really looked at making sure that women were equally represented um, and had a say in our government. So working in some of those particular marches as well were things that I participated in as a social worker doing my social justice piece. All right, so moving along, when we start to think about the different roles that macro level social workers play, they're here. They're evaluating programs to see whether they work. They're providing research. They're also lobbyists, so they're working in the Capitol, working with legislators to look at moving various bills forward. They're advocates, they're policymakers, as well as administrators in organizations. So those are some of the roles. If you're thinking about macro practice, those are some of the things that you may want to think about in terms of that. So typically there's a divide between micro practice and macro practice. And students are usually kind of put in a bucket where they choose one or another. And the vast majority of students that I've known in my career have really moved towards micro practice, and eventually became therapists and clinical social workers. But macro practice is also interconnected because um, it's despite having far more evidence-based practice for micro practice, we know that if we don't get ahead of how dollars are spent or reallocated, then we're going to have a lot of other people who are constituents that are possibly going to not get the services they need and not live the quality of life that they need and not get anywhere close to social justice in their lifetime. So there's that combination that we need to think about. It's that combination between the private and the public. Um, both looks like they have an advocacy and a pursuit for social justice piece that are attached to them. They evolve as new issues arise. So as different decisions are being made at national levels that have an impact on what we do, whether it be health related, whether it be related to women's health, or whatever the issues might be, the practice of what becomes common in the practice in both areas are all of these particular things. Looking at having a vested interest in self-sufficiency and self-determination, and they're also promoted to, or dedicated to these positive outcomes. So we need to keep those things in mind. There are overlapping skill sets. As you think about the generalist intervention model, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago, the 6 steps are literally still the same in terms of what we do in terms of engaging and assessing and intervening. It's just the variations or the clients themselves change in that you're going from an individual and a family to an actual community. So there's a different way to do some of those assessment pieces at that community level that you'll learn and talk about in your communities class, probably happening in the spring. Um, Also weighing and evaluating these ethical implications and strategies. So making sure that we're always looking at being ethical as the NASW Code of Ethics has pretty much set forth for us. So there are some theories, macro level theories in social science that help us understand and explain why there are wide or examine a wide range of social problems. There are a variety of macro level theories and perspectives that inform macro challenge. And so some of those you will read about in your book. We'll talk about some of these now. The bioecological systems theory is a tool for understanding individuals, families, organizations, communities, and their surrounding environments. Again, so really having roots or really being tied to that uh, ecosystical model or that oh, I'm sorry, I'm missing the word here. But we talked about it back in chapter 1. So go back and read that whole piece. Recognizing that there are complex systems and rules and norms that are in place in all of these particular organizations. But if we understand how they all operate and whether they're operating efficiently and whether they're providing the kinds of outcomes that communities need. So really learning about what those interactions are like in the larger pieces. The systems theory piece looks at families, groups, organizations, communities as living systems, so that interact with each other, passing information, goods, resources back and forth from place to place. Um, Also looking at these, shifting the belief that these problem solutions reside in the individual. Um, there's also this essential piece that focuses on subsystem interaction. So what happens between the micro and the meso level? It's happening with an example might be looking at what happens in the neighborhood, and then what happens as people are matriculating to that neighborhood school. Are there issues that are there that come about in the community that can be resolved in the context of those particular two systems? So just an idea in terms of the different um, looks at what we're going to talk about here in terms of those different structures. So we got the structural racism piece. And we'll talk more about this in your Understanding Systems of Privilege and Oppression class that you'll be taking at some point in time here during your career as a student at Scholastica. And we recognize that from the structural racism standpoint, that racism is just a regular part of American society. Nothing new. It's not abhorrent. It's just the way that it is and always has been. It's systematic, it's pervasive. You can find evidence of racism in every major institution and system in our country. And when I say major institutions, I'm thinking about things like media or education. I'm looking at religious institutions, financial institutions, political institutions. All have systems that have put rules and regulations in place that limit and structure racism into the equation. Um, and then when we start to look at the data, Black people are frequently on the lower end of privilege scale. Structural racism highlights that whiteness and dominance and superiority and privilege are just the norm. It's just kind of the way it is. And that these it's embedded in these institutions. So if you start to take a look at some of the policies and procedures in a lot of different institutions, you will see that structurally, if you kind of go through that, folks are weeded out, and it's based on policy and decisions that run that institution as opposed to anything else. Then you've got institutional racism, which is one type of structural racism that I just talked about in terms of those larger institutions. We talked about banking, we talked about education systems, we talked about media. If we think about who owns and who controls them, and they're in business to make money oftentimes. And if they lock out the voices that are the minority voices, then they're not included in the final products. And, when we look at the criminal justice system, for example, it's a really easy one to pick. And we start to look at who's incarcerated disproportionately. And you've got brown and marginalized people of color who are overrepresented in the systems for crimes that um, many white counterparts wouldn't even go to jail for. So, a lot of things that we need to be aware of in terms of that. Recognizing the interconnectedness of structural racism. When we know that we have these implicit biases that are built into our organizations, our institutions, our schools, um, that we have clear evidence of racial inequity when we start to look at life term living outcomes, the quality of life, who's poor, who's not, who has access to housing, who doesn't, who's been discriminated against before. Those kind of things are all a part of that interconnectedness. And then we have the disproportionality. So we have this whole concept of underrepresentation or overrepresentation compared by its percentage in the population. So let me give you an example of what that means. So um, in Metro County that I live near, there is a child population for African Americans of about, I would say, 19%. So the vast majority of the children who live in this particular county are Caucasian. And the second largest number would be African Americans. The smallest number of children who live in this community are actually Native American. So when we think about things like child protective services or intervention from child protection, then we know that there's a prevalency rate. And the prevalency rate means that this is how prevalent this particular issue is in a community at any given time. So child protection, for example, or should I say child abuse and neglect, has a 9% prevalency rate. So if we have 9% of the children who are expected to experience some form of abuse and neglect and come to the attention of the authorities, then why is it that American Indian kids who represent 1% of the kids in this particular county actually represent 6% of the children who are actually in the child protection system and in out of home placement? And the numbers are close to 50% for African American kids, and children who are Caucasian are actually underrepresented in the system. So, what does that mean? Well, it means that there are probably some kids of color who are in the system that don't need to be there, um, or there needs to be other means in terms of how to address that. And then there are also children who are white who are probably not being seen by the system and are probably at greater risk of harm and dying. So again, it has its implications. So when we think about that disproportionality piece, it's a really interesting piece. We think about things like the achievement gap. We've got learning gaps. We've got opportunity gaps. So when we think about why those particular systems exist, then we have to trace it back to structural and institutional racism. Historical trauma. When we think about what happens to people, and we know that trauma informed care is very real, and that oftentimes many of the clients that we see or things that happen in the community are a result of things that were actually imposed upon that community or upon that family or individual, or there were things that that family or individual didn't get that created this trauma for them, and it's historical. So, um, historical trauma, when we think about the journey of um, the Native Americans who were or the original Americans in this country before they were discovered, and the trauma that they've experienced as a race of people or a group of people, and their numbers in terms of the population has dwindled dramatically. Their living situations are different. They are recognized as a sovereign nation within a nation to maintain their own heritage, and they had to fight for all of those particular things. They had land taken from them, the whole 9 yards, just goes on and on. African American folks were slaves. My ancestors were slaves. Someone actually owned them. It's like many people own shoes or uh, animals or pets. And that's a reality. And they were denied the access and the right to vote and the right to have housing and any number of other things. And to this day, some of that stuff still actually happens. Slavery, thank God, does not. But when you think about the impact of that type of trauma for those particular two um, communities that I just talked about, um, think about how does that play itself out over a period of time if we still have systems that perpetuate that same type of trauma. So again, thinking about those kind of things and looking at those things, when we think about the Holocaust, I think it's trauma informed in terms of how we need to deal with that. Um, Historical trauma affects macro practice in several ways. Um, there's colorism and skin privilege. There's color-based disparities in housing. Um, there are any number of different things that continue to be a part of how our system works. And so that's why there's a need for macro practice to really take a look at those things. It also ties very closely into social justice and this whole notion that social change needs to have equal access and equality, tolerance, compassion, and fairness and meaningful participation from all of its members of society, not just those who are deemed the most worthy to do so. Um, we also have to think about the social justice framework in terms of assessing problems and how they contribute to the debilitating effects of inequality as well as oppression. Um, and social workers have to just know these things as you're moving towards working for the outcome of the community that you're serving or the clients that you're actually serving, and making sure that it's a socially just process before we're all said and done. Um, Looking at removing those barriers that make it difficult for people to access services. Um, and if you listen closely or pay attention to national politics as well as state level politics, and you see the decisions that are made by the various political parties that are in power or in control at that point in time, they're usually around looking at what their constituents are or what they want. And they very seldom really speak to the real issues of social justice and having a level playing field for everyone. So, we as a voting society have a responsibility in that. And we'll talk way more about that when we get to American social welfare policy in January. Again, and we took out to look at the helping process and the macro level. It's large scale change that we're really looking at. It's for exploration, engagement, assessment planning, uh, implementation, goal attainment, and then termination. So following these fixed three steps. So this can take a lot of time. It can take months or even years to get a process in place. um, we also need to make sure that we have the understanding and cooperation from the communities that we're working with. It's not our job to go in and impose our will on the community. It's our community. It's our job to work with the community to move their particular goals forward. And when we see the process that we need, then we're no longer needed, and we're able to step outside of the process. So community organizing, something that you will learn quite a bit more about in your communities class also in the spring. So we're just kind of touching on it just lightly here now. But it's around organizing action that's larger scale intended to affect social change. So what kind of things are happening in neighborhoods? Why is there homelessness? Why are people unable to have adequate fooding and clothing? Or why can't people find jobs that pay a livable wage? Those are all community organizing kinds of issues. Controlling the price of rent, controlling the price of food and housing, as well as transportation, are all community organizing types of issues that the community has a voice in saying something about how those things need to look and how they need to come into place. And then organizational change, when we start to look at businesses and or agencies and companies in terms of how they're structured, Are they people focused? Are they technology focused? Are they looking at structural change? What are some of the pressures? Do they create good work environments for the people who work there? Is it hazardous? Those are the things that we need to think about when we think about organizational policy development. And then when we think about policy development, it's around analysis in terms of really understanding what policies already exist, what are they designed to do, are they working, are they fair, are they ethical, do they make it the change that they set out to make, or are they flawed and they're not doing what they need to do? Do they need to have more funding, or do they need to have more teeth so that there can be consequences if things are not followed? So these are things to think about when you're thinking about policy development. And in your American Social Welfare Policy class, you will have a major assignment that will involve you doing a policy analysis and making recommendations about how to do that. So there'll be much more time that we'll go into that whole exploration piece. You'll also be doing some work in your community class around more community organizing and doing community level assessments so you can get a sense of how to gauge the scope of the issues that are happening in the larger community. Then we're going to really take a look at how the organizational change kind of flows in terms of the exploration stage all the way through what's critical, what's identified, the agency's performance, financial standings, service effectiveness, the whole 9 yards in terms of that policy development. So making sure that we got policy that takes a look at all of these particular various aspects of the work that we do to make sure that they're done in a consistent and decent and proper way. We've got the engagement step, and I'm going to give you guys a chance to read for a little bit and so I can talk a little bit less. We've got stage 2 of community organizing. We'll do some reading here again. Ways to look at making change in the context of an organization. Importance of grassroots change. Policy development. The assessment. Community organizing. Change. Back to policy development. Organizing. These are just some steps in terms of really looking at what you need to do if you're looking at organizing in the community. Implementation when we're looking at organizational change. Policy development. Goal attainment and community organizing. Organizational change. That goal attainment piece again. Policy development. Making sure that we've got goals that are concise, measurable, that can be evaluated, and that we can have data that can tell us whether it's working or not. And then finally, as we're starting to move towards termination, once we've gotten things in place and we've gotten some ways to get feedback, it's time for people to pull out. How social media can play a critical role in terms of the work that we're doing as it relates to a lot of the macro practice pieces that need to happen. So now I recognize that that was a lot of information, and so I breezed through it relatively quickly. But do some reading around that particular piece, and don't get too worried in that literally the things that we talked about here in this particular class, you're going to spend, they're going to be classes dedicated primarily to that type of social work practice. And so, again, as I had alluded to it a couple of times, in the spring, you will have American Social Welfare Policy, which will help you understand and work through some of those macro level policy pieces, as well as you will also have social work with communities, which is a class that really looks at that community organizing, community assessment piece. So this is just kind of a foretaste or a pretext of what you're going to be taking some time learning about in the coming months. So as always, do your readings, and I will see you later.